speaking of Jewish literature, we do now have to turn to speaking of Purim, which is a holiday that occurs not tied to the harvest festival, although it does happen on the 14th of a Jewish month, which is close to a full moon, remember. 15th of the Jewish month is always a full moon. But it's a holiday that really has no harvest background that we know of, and it's technically not really priestly either. You'll notice Purim wasn't in that list in Leviticus 23. It wasn't mentioned at all, but it's set at least in the same time period. And it most likely was created during that Second Temple period, 500 BCE to about 70 of the Common Era. The observance of Purim is based on the book of Esther, which does appear in the Hebrew Bible, but later in the third part of the Hebrew Bible. And we'll see that again when we talk about Jewish literature as well. There are some claims that the story of Esther may actually have its basis in Babylonian mythology, because there's an interesting coincidence of the names. Esther sounds a lot like Ishtar, which is a Babylonian goddess. And Mordecai sounds a lot like Marduk, who's also a Babylonian divinity. Of course, in this case, Esther is the niece, but Ishtar and Marduk are sort of peers in the Babylonian pantheon, and there's no legend in Babylonian mythology that matches this kind of a story. And there's even a hint of something else going on in the book of Esther, because Esther has a Hebrew name that's different from Esther. It is Hadassah. So if you think of the Jewish Women's Organization, her Jewish name is Hadassah in the book. So what's Esther is probably her daily street name, her Babylonian name. A lot of Jews today actually have an English name or a general culture name, and then have a Jewish name that's a Hebrew or Yiddish background that works differently. So the story of Esther and Mordecai doesn't seem to match with any other mythology that we have. And there are a number of features of the story that make us very dubious that it's actually history. To give you some examples, it says that Mordecai was among the generation that was taken into exile when the Babylonian temple was destroyed. And the Babylonian Empire is ultimately conquered by the Persian Empire. And this is set in the Persian Empire under Ahasuerus. Well, that's often thought to be the Persian king Artaxerxes. There was Xerxes and Artaxerxes, and they sort of flop back and forth. But if it was Artaxerxes, then Mordecai would have to be like 120 years old based on the dates when we know Artaxerxes' reign. So that's a problem. A second problem is the fact that the queen is chosen by a beauty contest, except it isn't really a beauty contest if you actually read the book. What happens is the king is displeased with his current wife because she won't obey his commands. And so he has his stewards gather up all the available young women, has them come to his palace. They have to stay there for a full year of bathing in perfumes, and by the way, making sure they're not pregnant. And as a side result, right, of having them under lock and key for a year. And then the king chooses one of them at a time to come and spend the night with him. And then they go into a second harem house afterwards. I jokingly call that the used harem house, or lightly used, I guess, harem house, or test-driven once. And that's how he's choosing his queen. It's a sex audition. It is not a beauty contest, as you hear in many Sunday schools. But this holiday, for a variety of reasons, as we'll see, has become sort of a Sunday school, it's the heater, it has become a kind of Sunday school focused holiday. And so they had to clean up the story a bit for the little kids. In fact, I'll talk a little bit about, there's something in the room that I'll be showing you in a little bit. I did soften the language in this because this was a Sunday school project. So that's a problem, the beauty contest, because we know that that's not how the Persians chose their queens. They chose noble families. It's a matchmaking of noble families. You don't do a general beauty contest to find the queen. Another problem is what happens at the end of the story, where the Jews are allowed to kill thousands and thousands of Persians. It's very unlikely the Persian king would allow any of his peoples to kill thousands of others of his peoples as part of what's happening. Or at the end it says the king can't take back his own command. Why can't he issue a new command? Like it seems unlikely. And there's also the fact that at the end, the Jews fight back, and they fight back so much that some non-Jews pretend to be Jewish. They actually use the word in Hebrew, mityahed, they Judaized out of fear of the Jews. And so I often think of this as like a diaspora wish fulfillment story, where they're trying to kill us, but we kill lots of them, and when they're so afraid, they pretend to be us instead of the other way around, right? Which is more often the story. But the number one giveaway on this has to do with the names of the protagonists. So on one hand, you have Mordecai, who is described as a descendant of King Saul. And you have Haman, who is described as a descendant of Amalek. Now, Amalek is the inveterate enemy of the Hebrew peoples. It's the nation that attacked Israel during the Exodus from behind, whose name is supposed to be blotted out from under heaven, and you should never forget what Amalek did to you. Now, how you're supposed to do both of those, how you're supposed to blot out their memory and remember what they did to you at the same time is not clarified, but they're definitely bad. And one of the kings of the Amalekite line is named Agag. King Agag is the reason why King Saul is overthrown as king and dies, because he spares Agag's life. He attacks the Amalekites. He's told to wipe them all out, and he spares the king. And it pisses off God so much, he tells Samuel, tell Saul he's out, kaput. And in fact, shortly thereafter, Saul does die. So guess who Haman is descended from? From Agag. He's called the Akagi the Agagites. There's no other Agagites anywhere in the Torah, in the Hebrew Bible, except here. So a descendant of King Saul comes into conflict with a descendant of King Agag. What are the odds? Well, in literature, anything's possible, right? So this is the framing for the story that leads us to believe it's unlikely to have actually happened historically. Now, what happens in the story is you have this beauty contest for the new queen. Ultimately, Esther is the victor. And the rabbis go to great lengths to explain how she didn't eat any non-kosher food when she was there. And that, again, they're applying their view of things back into the story. But also, Mordecai begins to have his run-in with Haman, who is the king's vizier, like the prime minister. And Haman wants everyone to bow to him, and Mordecai says, I won't bow to you because I'm Jewish. We only bow to our God. We don't bow to anyone, except the word God doesn't appear in the entire book. There's one part where Mordecai kind of alludes to it, but there's no clear mention of God anywhere in the book of Esther. It's all about how people relate to people and solve their own problems using human power. It's actually a very humanistic text in that way. It also includes an intermarriage, which nobody talks about, but it's not like Esther told the king she was Jewish. In fact, she doesn't tell the king she's Jewish early on. It says so explicitly. She kept her name and her people secret. So Mordecai resists Haman. Haman decides to kill Mordecai. They throw lots or dice. The word for lot is pur. That's why it's called Purim. It's dice. And that determines the date is going to be in the month of Adar, which is all the way at the end of the calendar, 12 months away. Remember, the first month is Nisan, where Passover is. Adar is the one just before it. So again, it's the new year in the spring, according to this calendar being described here. So they roll the dice, the date's set, and Mordecai is going to be wiped out. However, in the meantime, Mordecai hears a plot to kill the king, and he reports it. The men are stopped, and Mordecai is rewarded. There's a famous episode where the king invites Haman to come in, and Haman says, the king must want to give me a special honor. And the king says, what would you do for a man who's done something wonderful for the king? And Haman says, well, you should parade him around on a horse in front of the whole city and make everyone cheer him. And great, do that for Mordecai. Again, you feel like the comedy style of story here. And Haman hates Mordecai even more. Eventually, Esther is told by Mordecai, you have to help us. She goes to the king at great danger to herself and asks the king to dinner. Haman also comes to dinner, and she confronts him and says, I am a Jew, just like those people he's going to wipe out and kill, who he bribed the king to be able to do. And me and my people are going to die. And the king is mad and walks out. Haman falls on the couch trying to beg for his life. The king comes back, decides it looks like he's trying to rape her. And so he condemns Haman to death. In fact, Haman and all 13 of his sons are hung on the very same gallows on which he had envisioned hanging Mordecai. And the day of disaster turns into a great day of celebration for the Hebrew people. And it wraps up in chapter 9 of the book. So we're going to jump to that right here. And Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters to all the Jews in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to establish this among them. They should keep the 14th day of the month of Adar and the 15th of the same yearly, like the days when the Jews rested from their enemies, and the month which was turned from them from sorrow to joy, from mourning to a holiday. They should make of them days of feasting and joy and send portions to one another and gifts to the poor. And there's sort of a summary of the story here. Haman wanted to destroy them, and Esther came to the king and allowed the plot to be overturned, and he and his son should be hanged on the gallows. And so the Jews decided to decree this as a holiday for all time and their seed. And they wrote with authority to all the Jews of all the provinces of the king. Now, we know that this didn't happen historically, but it's worth asking the question, when did the book of Purim, the book of Esther get written? When did this holiday start? It clearly happened during some kind of diaspora experience. It shows a familiarity with some aspects of the Persian court and kingdoms. And it's certainly set outside of the land of Israel. There's very few stories that are set like that. You've got the book of Jonah, he goes to Nineveh in Assyria, but and there's the exile in Babylon, but so this seems to reflect some authentic diaspora experience. But we do have a clue of when it may have been in some form put into place. And that's in the book of 2nd Maccabees. At the end of the book of 2nd Maccabees, which describes the Maccabean victory over the Syrian Greeks, you have a general named Nicanor who comes to fight, and the Jews fight back. They're so successful, they cut off his head and his arm and carry them to Jerusalem as trophies. They display them actually outside the city, and they decreed, look at the very end, they decreed by public vote never to let this day go unobserved, but to celebrate the 13th day of the 12th month, which is called Adar in the Syrian language, the day before Mordecai's day. That's the only reference we get. Mordecai's day, which is actually the 14th of Adar, right? Well, what do they do on Mordecai's day? And why is it called Mordecai's day instead of Purim? And what about Esther? And what did they read? And what was the story? We don't have the details. But we have this little data point that suggests there's some day set at this time of year that's called Mordecai's Day about somebody named Mordecai doing something. And we don't have enough details. But we do have a negative piece of evidence that suggests it wasn't a universal observance. And that is the library of the Dead Sea Scrolls community. In Qumran, near the Dead Sea, they found in 1947 and following a series of scrolls that had been hidden in clay jars. In fact, you can see the design of the jars on the roof of the museum in Jerusalem that contains the scrolls. It's called the Shrine of the Book, and they designed it to look like the jars that were holding the scrolls. It looks like a big Hershey's Kiss, actually, on top of it. That's the lid. But through all the texts they found books that the community wrote themselves. They found fragments of other books that were popular at the time. They found lots of biblical texts. There is no record of any fragment of the book of Esther in the scrolls in Qumran.
And that's the only one, everything else.
And everyone else, there's at least some fragment of something. Now, does that mean we didn't find it? And it's possible. There are lots of copies of Isaiah. They really liked Isaiah. But there just isn't an Esther there. And so what does that suggest? Well, A, they might not have liked the book. After all, it has a mixing of a Jew and a non-Jew, and they were very into purity and separation from the sons of darkness, as they refer to the outside world. It takes place outside the land of Israel during exile. There's no mention of God anywhere in the text. I mean, there are a number of reasons why they might not have wanted to include it there. But it also suggests that it wasn't a core part of the canon yet, that maybe there was some flexibility of whether you could have a canon with Esther or without Esther, because they don't have it. So I know they don't have Maccabees because that's Greek and that's in the Septuagint, which is more the Alexandrian community, and they're very anti-Greek in the Dead Sea Scrolls community.
Because the Maccabees only shows up in the Catholic Bible.
Yeah, Maccabees today is in the Catholic Bible, or the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible that Alexandrian Jews made. So it was a Jewish book. but Jews themselves didn't save it. Yeah, we'll talk more, again, we'll talk a little bit more about the canon when we get to Jewish literature in a few sessions. So when the rabbis get this holiday, they see what it describes here at the end of the book of Esther, that these should be days that are turned from sorrow to joy, from mourning to a holiday. You should make it a day of mishteh v'simcha, feasting and joy. Literally, mishteh means drinking, from the word shatah, to drink, and sending gifts to one another and gifts to the poor. So they actually prescribe all three of those things, that you send gifts to your neighbor. This is a tradition sort of slurred together called shlach manos, the sending of gifts to one's neighbor, and also gifts to the poor, gifts to charity, and drinking. In fact, it said you should get so drunk that you can't tell the difference between Mordecai and Haman. Rabbah said it is the duty of a man to mellow himself with wine on Purim until he cannot tell the difference between Arur Haman, cursed be Haman, and Baruch Mordecai, blessed is Mordecai. But then they include a cautionary tale. Rabbah, a different Rabbah, and Rabbi Zerah joined together in a Purim feast. They became shikar, they became drunk, mellow. And Rabbah arose and cut Rabbi Zerah's throat. On the next day, he prayed on his behalf and revived him. Next year, he said, will your honor come and we will have the Purim feast together? He replied, a miracle does not take place on every occasion. Fool me once, I'm not going back to your house for Purim. You are a mean drunk, to put it nicely. But there definitely is a tradition of sort of carnival kind of excesses, I mean, this happens in other cultures too. The long winter is over and you sort of want to cut loose, and you got Mardi Gras, you've got Carnival, and you've got, well, this is in a similar season, and it's a kind of Jewish carnival. So there is a tradition of reading a Megillah. Megillah means scroll. So if someone ever says, tell me the whole Megillah, tell me the Ganze Megillah, that means the whole scroll, the whole story. And so it's traditionally on a one-pole scroll, not a two-pole like a Torah. It's one pole with just the text written around it. Again, it's hand-inscribed, but sometimes Megillot are illuminated or decorated. And they're often done, in a very ornate way. And you read the scroll in front of the congregation as part of the Purim celebration, and you cheer when you hear Esther's name, or you cheer when you hear Mordecai's name, and when you hear Haman's name, you drown him out, either by booing or with something like this, which is called in Yiddish a grogger, or in Hebrew a ra'ashan, a noisemaker. We actually have an industrial size one just for comedic value for the Sunday school class. But you use those noisemakers as part of the raucousness of the reading of the Megillah. And of course, today, most people aren't understanding the Hebrew anyways, but you can still hear where Haman and where Mordecai's names appear. There's also a tradition of putting on costumes and dressing up as part of Purim. It becomes like a Jewish Halloween. And in fact, in Israel, it is the equivalent of Halloween because kids dress up and go out to public spaces.
You showed a video about that sometime. I remember seeing you showed a video of people dressing up.
Yeah, you can see examples of it. I mean, I'll include a link in the notes for the video for this. I did a program last Purim. It was called Drunk History Purim Edition. And I and one of my rabbinic colleagues, actually, we did get drunk. I chose whiskey sour. She had a different one. And we had a lot of fun, but we did some real content on what Purim's about and how to celebrate and so on. We had a rap battle as one of the features. So I'll put a link for that video in the, I thank you. I'll put a link for the video for that in the like the show notes on the YouTube video. But in any case, not only are you supposed to dress up in costumes, but there's even a tradition of doing a Purim spiel, like a play version of the Purim story. And often what would happen is you would go to excesses. You would mock people you weren't normally allowed to mock, because after all, it's Purim. You can get away with it. It can be transgressive. Again, it's that kind of, carnival excess. And so Jews would act these out, and often rabbis trying to ban the Purim spiel because it was too profane and it was too ribald and it was too bawdy and it made fun of the rabbi and it made fun of the king, and it was too unserious, and they didn't like it. There's even a tradition of doing what's called Purim Torah, which is like playing with Torah and mocking it in some ways. And again, it's not what you're supposed to do. One tradition that evolved in the Eastern Jewish diaspora, Eastern European Jewish diaspora, was the eating of special poppy seed pastries that are usually done in a triangle. Now, people, they ask, why is it a triangle? Some people will connect it with the story. They think Haman had a three-cornered hat, or that Haman's ears were kind of pointy, like he was a Vulcan or something. I'm not sure. In fact, in Hebrew, the word for these things is Oznei Haman, Haman's ears. But the Yiddish name for him is what gives us a clue to where they come from, because in Yiddish, they're called Hamantashen. One Hamantash, plural is Hamantashen. So you can't have Hamantashens. It's double plural, if you know the grammar. It's one of my pet peeves. It's one Hamantash, plural Hamantashen. But what does it mean? Well, you have to know some German. Tasch in German is a pocket, and Mon in German is poppy seeds. So originally it was a montage, it was just a poppy seed pocket, and then they made a pun out of it and called it a Hamantash. So it became a Haman's pocket, or a treat for Purim. Now there is also a tradition of marking Purim on a second day in certain cities. It describes later in the book of Esther that near the end of Purim, the Jews got to fight back a second day in Shushan, in the capital itself. So then people in walled cities from a long time ago, like Jerusalem, can do a second day of Purim called Shushan Purim. But in most cases, it's just on the 14th of that month of Adar. And it occurs generally in February or March, depending on the season. But different cultures have evolved different details of Purim. Just to give one more example, in Persia, this is actually a major holiday because it takes place there. They're very excited, and Persian Jews made a big deal out of Purim. There was a shrine in Persia called Esther's grave. Who knows if it was, Esther or not, but it's what they called Esther's grave. They would also burn Haman in effigy. That was one of their things, hang him on a gibbet and burn him. And they would do something else I find very creative. They would write the name of Haman on the bottom of their shoes. And then all day long, they're scuffing out their shoes and they're scuffing out Haman's name all through the town. Now, in terms of what humanistic Jews do with this holiday, well, it didn't happen historically, but we're not pedantic. I mean, we're not going to say, well, it didn't actually happen, so therefore we cannot observe this. No, we can have some fun with it, but we have to grapple with some of the difficult parts of it. The misogyny all through the story at the beginning, certainly, where the king says for his wife to appear before him, and when she doesn't, the minister said, you better sack her because otherwise no wife is going to ever listen to her husband again. And it appears in other parts in the story too. There's the revenge of the Jews against the Persians that is celebrated in the book, but we find distasteful. We don't do that. There's the challenging part is that Purim has had its own observances over the centuries, and one of them is particularly appalling. In the early 1990s, there was an American Jewish doctor who had moved to a West Bank settlement in Hebron, which is near the tomb of the patriarchs, where Abraham and Sarah are supposedly buried, and is a shrine for both Jews and for Muslims. And one year on Purim, he decided, I'm going to kill me some Amalek. And he took his machine gun and went into the mosque part of the tomb of the patriarchs and killed 24 people and wounded another 100 or so more before he himself was beaten to death by the crowd. This doctor's name was Baruch Goldstein. And in some circles in Israel today, he's a hero for killing Amalek. But for many of us, he's terrible. He's a villain. He's a mass murderer. And he did it because of what he read in this book. Because he said Amalek is Amalek, whether it's Haman or Hitler or these Palestinians. So there's a violence in the story that we don't feel comfortable with. We have to grapple with. On the other hand, there's a lot of positives. We talked about the humanistic side of the story. There's a feminine hero here. We don't get that very often in biblical stories. And there's an opportunity to be creative. So what I'm going to do now, if I can get the camera to work right, is I'm going to show you something I've displayed here in our classroom which is a project that our congregation did together. So we took the idea of creating an illuminated Megillah and made it a Sunday school project. So what we actually did, oh, go this way. Yeah. So what we actually did is, you can sort of see it here. I'll give you a zoom in just a minute. You can see we have the text in the middle with drawings all around it. So at one end you have the gallows that Haman is supposed to be hanging Mordecai on, that ultimately Haman is hung on. You've got depictions of the party at the beginning and other elements of the story all the way through. Let me take you back to me, and I've got one piece here I can show you a little more closely. So hopefully that comes through without too much glare. So you can see that we put the text in the middle for a different part of the story. So we just have, 10, 15 verses or so in a chunk in the Hebrew and then in an English translation again. Did I include the word eunuchs? I did not include the word eunuchs, because there are eunuchs managing the harem, because then they don't mess with the merchandise. But I just said servants. I decided, and I didn't use virgins either. I wanted to be Sunday school appropriate. But so we have the English text below, the Hebrew text, and then what the students did was they took half a sheet of paper and drew something based on what's in the passage that's being described on the page. And then we put them on the page and taped them down, and then took it to a big laminating machine and laminated the pieces, and then Velcroed the corners together, put their names on the back. You see there's little labels on the back of each of these pieces. Maybe you can. And it made a wonderful group project. It took us actually 3 years of this, with each class doing one section of the Megillah. And then we had our own congregational Megillah, and it cost us very little compared to what, paying a scribe to write one, and then it's kosher, but it's not personal. And this was really a wonderful collaborative project for our Sunday school, for them to think about different parts of the Purim story, for the kids that like graphic art and drawing, to get that part of activity done, and create a collaborative school project all together. It really was wonderful. We've done this twice now, 2 full cycles of the text, and it's really been a wonderful project for us to do. So this is one example of how you can be creative with the idea of the Megillah and the material culture aspects of it. You can have people make their own groggers, they can make their own masks, you can talk about what masks do we wear in general. And we actually broke up the text to match the curriculum. So the Holocaust class was talking about Haman wanting to kill all the Jews. And the Israel class was talking about Jews fighting back and how did they go too far or not. So you could find, curricular relevance in the different aspects of the story. So this is just one way you can take Purim and be creative with it. And make it a learning experience in a totally consistent humanistic way. So with that, I'll stop now and ask if you have any comments or questions or anything else about Purim that you want to bring up or talk about. Yeah.
I have one question, because in the book that that has all the different definitions in it, I can't. Humanistic.
The Guide to Humanistic Jews.
Yeah, it said that the Maccabees were celebrating the defeat of Nicanor on the 14th, and that the rabbis decided to sort of and put this feast of Esther on the 14th in order to, I don't know, so that seems
You're jumbled a little bit. They put the fast of Esther on the 13th, which was Nicanor's Day.
Okay.
So Nicanor's Day was on the 13th. It says in that passage, it said they celebrated the 13th, the day before Mordecai's Day.
Right.
So the rabbis put a fast day on Nicanor's Day. However, the fast of Esther actually develops in the Middle Ages. So it probably is not an anti-Maccabee thing.
Oh,
that's a factual, like a chronological error in that guide. Because it is true the Maccabees were not liked by the rabbis at all. They really de-emphasized Hanukkah. It's the only holiday that doesn't have its own tractate in the Hebrew, in the Talmud, where Shabbat has a whole tractate on Shabbat. There's a whole tractate on Eruvin, on the Eruv laws. They make a whole tractate on it. So that's, they definitely didn't like the Maccabees, but in that case, it's just semi-coincidence that what was Nicanor's Day became the fast of Esther, but she's supposedly fasting before she goes to the king. But it's no Jews had done Nicanor's Day for a long time by the time fast of Esther was
Probably went out with the Maccabees.
Yeah, right, exactly. Because the Jews didn't keep the book of Maccabees, so they didn't even know about it. Right.
Okay, I just want to clarify that, just to see that there was a.
Yeah, that was the, so the dating is correct in the guide, but I think that the timing of when the different holidays
That
take
makes
place
sense.
is a little bit separate. Someone's asking for how far back does the dressing up aspect of the holiday go? I'm honestly not sure. It goes back quite a ways to the Middle Ages. I think the kids' costume thing may be a later innovation, but the Purim spiel does go back to their episodes of it, I believe, in the 1300s, 1400s in parts of Italy and in Eastern Europe. In most cases, we have records of rabbis complaining about them. That's the record. But we don't have the script that they use, but we have the complaints about them. But that indicates that people are doing it and that rabbis don't like it. So that's probably the beginning of that spiel. The idea of everyone dressing up in costume, I think, is a more recent development. But again, there are sources that talk about this. There's a wonderful book called Guide to Jewish Holy Days by Chaim Schaus, which was also published as the Jewish Festivals, if you're looking for used book copies. His last name is Schauss. He does a great job talking about the historical evolution of the holidays. The only problem is that he was not immortal. I mean, his book was written in 1930 something. So it's current as of then. What we do now, of course, has evolved again. So he doesn't talk about Israeli customs, and he doesn't, it doesn't talk about bat mitzvah because those weren't institutions then. But in any case, Schaus's books on the life cycle and on Jewish holidays are really excellent resources for that kind of historical development question. And so I strongly commend them to you. All right. Well, I wish you a safe drive home. Fortunately, we didn't drink for this, this study of Purim. And next time we'll be picking up with our more modern holidays. And we'll also eventually get to the minor fast days that appear later on in the Jewish calendar. Most of them happen over the summer, and we'll talk about where each of them comes from. But I do want to point out that the fast days really prove that the joke version of Jewish holidays are just wrong. The joke version of Jewish holidays is, they tried to kill us, they failed, let's eat. Now, which holidays does that apply to? It applies to Hanukkah, it applies to Passover, it applies to Purim. Doesn't apply to Rosh Hashanah, certainly doesn't apply to Yom Kippur. Let's eat. Let's eat after 26 hours. I mean, it doesn't apply to all the fast days. It doesn't apply to a lot of the holidays. Nobody's trying to kill you on Tu B'Shvat. You're eating fruits because of the harvest. But so why does that become the joke of the Jewish holidays? Because what are the two most observed Jewish holidays in diaspora? Hanukkah and Passover, and maybe Purim they remember from Sunday school and the carnival and all the games. So people think that's what every Jewish holiday is, but it might be just every Jewish holiday they celebrate, which is not the same, Venn diagram set.